Welcome to TRS Clips, India's fastest learning portal. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit that bell icon. Russia and Ukraine, sir. I feel it's not as reported in India as it should be. What's your take on it? What are you making of this whole situation?
Well, it's a very interesting situation right now, very complex, very fast-moving situation. What we are seeing right now, as of today, end of February, what we are seeing is that the geopolitical analysts and observers and forecasters, the past 48 hours, they would not have slept much because so much is happening, so many events have happened just very recently, and things are moving very fast. So what we have seen is that President Putin of Russia has recently announced that his nation is going to recognize the independence of two breakaway republics, which are part of Ukraine, which is the two republics, which is Luhansk and Donetsk. So those two have been declared independent, and Russia has now recognized that. So that is tantamount to, in a way, annexation of some parts of Ukrainian territory. Of course, there is more that Russia is eyeing, and they have given a number of historical and other reasons to justify their claims on this territory. So that's what's happening right now. The NATO, the Americans are pushing back. They are very unhappy about it, but there's nothing it looks like they can do right now to stop this from happening. They don't want to see a war. Nobody wants a war. Wars are dangerous. They are destructive. So the Russians essentially have achieved something, a significant, not small territorial gain without resorting to war. They have been saber rattling and all that. And they used a certain timing. The Winter Olympics were happening in Beijing, in China, and the entire world's attention was focused there. At that time, they started this pressure point on Eastern Europe. The Chinese are also imparting some pressure on Taiwan. We know they have been escalating their incursions the past few months. So it looks like there has been this coordinated effort, a double pincer movement, a two-front war threat, the kind of threat that we in India face all the time. So the same sort of thing has been orchestrated by these two countries in cooperation with each other. And right now we are seeing that parts of Ukraine are now going into essentially de facto Russian control.
So one thing that came up in my research for this episode was the very, very complex history of domestic politics that are happening in that region. Usually when we do these kind of podcasts with you, we did one about the Afghanistan crisis in Hindi. And I know you went back to the 70s to begin explaining that. Now, in order for people to understand what's happening in Ukraine now, how far back do you really have to go? Because according to me, you have to go really, really far back. But so you're the historian, so I'll let you kind of begin the story in your own way.
So I think to understand the roots of this conflict, etc., I think we may need to go back 1,000 years. And I can make it fast. I don't want to go into great detail. We need to consider what's happening right now. But to understand the history of why this conflict happens, we have to go back to the roots of the Russian people. So the Russian people are, well, I think I should go back 2,000 years and make it very brief. So the Russian peoples are a Slavic people. Now, the first historical attested record of the Slavic people is in Roman records in the 1st or 2nd century AD. And they have always been settled in parts of Eastern Europe, more or less. And they were an Indo-European people. They used to worship the thunder god, the rain god, Parjanya, Perun, they used to call him, and so on. Now, so they settled in parts of Eastern Europe. Then there was this constant migration that happens. The Huns came from the east, and also the Slavs were forced to move westwards and on. Then what you had is that there were these Vikings. You know the Vikings, those warriors from Scandinavia. So they kind of took over the leadership of the Slavic peoples, just briefly. They were called the Varangians. Their leader was called, what was his name? Olaf, Prince Olaf, I believe his name was, or Prince Oleg, I think, Prince Oleg. And his father was Rurik, the leader of the Kievan Rus. So the Rus, the name of the Russians, it comes from these Varangians, these Vikings, who called themselves Rus. And they became the leaders, and that's how the Slavic peoples of present-day Russia, their ancestors came to be called Rus, and they were in present-day Ukraine, Muscovy, etc., all that. And then for some time, what you had is that the Russians were under the Mongols. After the expansion of Genghis Khan, the Mongols took over Russia, and for quite some time, a couple of centuries at least, they were under Mongol rule. Then again they became independent. Now this territory called Ukraine, it has been it has been settled by Scythians, Alans, Huns, Bulgars, Mongols, Tatars, all these people. In the 14th century, what is now Ukraine was called Little Russia. Now, in the 17th and 18th century, Russians, Serbs, Greeks, etc., settled there, and they called this region Novorossiya, which means New Russia. And later it came to be known as Ukraina or Okrania, which means the Russian borderland. All right. So it's always been a Russian territory. This is history. There is nothing controversial about this. It's always been Russian territory. Now, the Ukrainian language, it emerged out of this region at some time. It is just another Slavic language. You can consider it to be a dialect of Russian in some way. It's very similar and so on. Sounds the same. And it's more or less the same, right? So that is the history going back a few centuries. Now, after the 1917 Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks came to power. Lenin, Stalin, all these people, Trotsky, and so on. Trotsky was taken care of earlier. That doesn't matter. So the USSR started taking shape at that time. Socialism, communism, all that. And these various so-called Soviet republics were organized in a variety of ways, just for administrative purposes. So a lot of Russian territory was given over to what is now called Ukraine. Ukraine was an administrative division within the USSR. And the constitution of the USSR was such that technically, each Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR was like a nation on its own, technically, and they had the right technically to secede. But under somebody like Stalin, even the dream of seceding out of the USSR could not occur. So it was a very centralized state, the USSR. Now, what Stalin did was he added some Russian territory to the to Ukraine for administrative purposes. After the Second World War, it was, I think, Khrushchev who added Crimea, which is a Russian territory, to Ukraine for administrative purposes. And the situation went on until the dissolution of the USSR. So what happened is that earlier you had very powerful leaders like Stalin and so on. Later on, as is the story with every empire, every great state, you have weaker leadership. And so cracks begin to be visible. So what happened is that the subsequent Soviet leadership was not very good at managing the economy. The nation became decrepit and so on. In the 1980s, cracks began to be very visible. The economy was in a shambles. The West was doing very well and so on. And then Mikhail Gorbachev comes into the picture. If you look at the way they regard him even today in Russia, it's not very nicely. They don't think very highly of Mikhail Gorbachev because he presided over the destruction of the USSR. He is in some corners even alleged to be a Western agent. So what happened is that in 1989-91, in that period, the USSR disintegrated. And the leadership was so weak that all these republics declared independence. One of them was Ukraine. Ukraine became independent. And the deal was that whatever foreign debt, external debt the USSR owed to other countries, Russia would take care of that. But in exchange for that, all these breakaway republics, they would hand over all the USSR national assets to Russia, including nuclear weapons, right? So that was the deal. And Ukraine became one of these independent republics, independent nations. They handed over the nuclear warheads, weapons, etc., and they kept on getting lots of aid, subsidies from Russia. So it's about, in the last 20 years or so, they've got about $250 billion of subsidized aid from the from the Russians and so on. So that is the situation. Now, what happened is that typically, so until 2013, you had Volodymyr Zelensky, who was the president in Ukraine. Now in 2013, 2014, there was this Euromaidan revolution that happened in Ukraine. So this is essentially, what happened is that the elected president, I'm sorry, it was not Volodymyr Zelensky, it was Viktor Yanukovych who was the president. Sorry, so that's a correction. So this guy who was the elected president, he was deposed. He was forcibly removed. He was ousted in this revolution, and a pro-EU, pro-NATO government was installed by early 2014, by February 2014. So this is essentially a pro-NATO regime change. It's essentially a coup. Vladimir Putin sees this as a coup. And a former actor and comedian, Zelensky, became the president of Ukraine. So this happened sometime in February 2014. And immediately, by the end of February 2014, what you see is that there is this emergence of pro-Russian unrest in Ukraine, especially in the east and the south parts of Ukraine, which have lots of people, a majority that are Russian speaking, and they identify themselves as Russians, the population. And even if you look at the whole of Ukraine today, what you find is that there are lots of Russian speaking people who consider themselves to be ethnic Russians, not Ukrainians. And the funny thing, the curious thing, is that Ukraine has not held a census for more than 20 years for some reason, because then these demographics will become very apparent. Right. So these are just facts. Okay. I'm not taking this side or that side. I'm just telling you what the way I see it, the way I read it. So what you have in 2014, February onwards, is there is unrest. Right. There is this resistance towards what's happening in Ukraine. So in March 2014, Crimea was annexed by Mr. Putin. Which, like I said, was traditionally a Russian territory. And then there is this war in this region. It's called the Donbas region, which is East and South Ukraine, right? So in 2014 itself, two independent republics were proclaimed, the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. So this is the eastern part of Ukraine and the southern part of Ukraine, right? Southeast and so on. So that's what happened. So these two republics declared their independence. Obviously, they were aided and abetted by the Russians, right? Then you had a referendum that happened in 2014 itself, Donbas status referendum, which sought to legitimize the establishment of these two republics, right? Then you had all this fighting that was happening between the pro-Russian militia and the Ukrainian forces. Some terrible things happened in 2014. This Malaysian Airlines flight 17 was shot down. They thought it was something else, and it was a horrible thing which happened. So that was a terrible tragedy that happened at this time. Then in September 2014, there was the first Minsk agreement between the warring sides, between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and some other mediators. It was a 12-point peace plan in September 2014. Within a couple of months, it was totally it collapsed. By early 2015, the whole thing collapsed, because in November 2014, you had the general elections that were held in the Donbas region, which elected the chief executives and the parliaments of this region. And by early 2015, by January, February, this agreement collapsed. Then in February, they started the whole thing again. Then you had the Minsk II protocol, Minsk II agreement, which is, I believe, a 13-point agreement, which was signed, and it has never been implemented, because the last 2 points about special status that should be given to Donbas, it is interpreted in different ways by both the sides. So there's never been agreement on that, and there's been this conflict which is going on. It has never become a hot war, but there is this insurgency, this conflict, artillery, fighting, shooting, all that's been going on since 2015, since February and so on. Now what happened is in 2021, there was an escalation of this fighting, and that's continued until right now, until 2022. And of late, there's been this big Russian military buildup on the Ukrainian border, on the eastern part of Ukraine. And what's also interesting is in December 2021, December last year, the president of Belarus essentially told Russia that he was willing to accommodate nuclear weapons again on Belarusian territory. And in December, I think it's in December, the constitution of Belarus was very subtly amended, which essentially says that Belarus is no longer bound by the principle of neutrality and all that. So what you can interpret this to be is that Belarus is now technically or de facto annexed by Russia. That's what's happened. Belarus is no longer independent in the truest sense of the word. It is now essentially part of the Russian orbit. So Belarus is now Russian, Crimea is Russian, Donbas is Russian, and the Russians are eyeing more territory, and they have justified it with proper historical precedent. Mr. Putin last night gave a long speech, nearly 1 hour speech, in which he laid out the entire history of what happened. He blamed Vladimir Lenin for the way the constitution was created and the way the powers were given to all the USSR republics, which in a sense is correct, what he said. So that's what's happening. What happened is that, see, in Ukraine, we had this weak government that was installed by the American-led NATO, which was a weak government. Wherever you don't have sufficient power, there's a power vacuum. And power is an expansionist force. It's like pressure. So where there is a power vacuum, some other power will come and take over. So that's what's happening in Russia. The Russians, always have, for the past 20 years, they have lamented the fact that their great USSR broke up, and that the fact that the NATO has been able to take various Russian orbit states into their orbit. And I think there was an agreement that was signed, or it was agreed upon between Russia and NATO, that Ukraine, Belarus, etc. would never be incorporated into NATO. And now that agreement was on the verge of being broken, and that's why all this is happening.